End of February 2008. The body of 38-year-old trooper Lila Porter was discovered in her home in Hanover, New Hampshire. Her teenage daughter, Emily, made the tragic discovery, finding her mother lying in a pool of blood in the kitchen. There was a single gunshot wound to Lila's chest, and the gun, a service-issued weapon, was placed near her hand, staged to appear as a suicide. Emily, trembling, called 911, but her panicked voice contrasted sharply with the calmness of the dispatcher. Local police and state investigators quickly arrived on the scene, led by Detective Garrett Lynch. A seasoned investigator with over 2 decades of experience. The initial assessment of the crime scene raised several questions. The service weapon was unusually clean despite the blood spatter, and there were no signs of forced entry into the house. Detective Lynch, who had spent years unraveling criminal mysteries, felt an unsettling sense that this case was different from the others he had investigated. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that disturbed him, but the subtle cracks that were beginning to show in the seemingly perfect life Lila had built. Lila Porter was known for her diligence and principles. She had joined the New Hampshire State Police in her late 20s, balancing her demanding role as a single mother with her ambition to rise in the male-dominated field of law enforcement. Her teenage daughter, Emily, was the center of her world. Lila worked long shifts, attended school events, and made sure to cherish family time with Emily. Her colleagues admired her for her kindness and hard work, often noting that she was always willing to lend a helping hand even after a grueling day of patrol. But despite her outward success, Lila struggled with loneliness and the desire for deeper connection. After her divorce, Lila found herself increasingly vulnerable and turned to her colleague Alan Hayes for companionship. Alan, a senior trooper in his early 40s, had been with the force for nearly 2 decades. He was charismatic and well-respected, admired for his quick thinking in high-pressure situations. Alan's marriage to Deborah, a school teacher known for her charitable work in the community, seemed stable from the outside. They had 2 young sons and lived in a picturesque home. But beneath the surface, Alan had confided in Lila about the cracks in his marriage. He felt trapped in a life that no longer fulfilled him, and he turned to Lila for comfort and companionship. What started as innocent camaraderie quickly escalated into an affair. Lila began confiding in Alan about her insecurities and fears, feeling unworthy of love and destined for a life of loneliness. Alan, meanwhile, expressed frustration with his own marriage, feeling emotionally disconnected from Deborah. The affair between the 2 troopers was passionate, but fraught with tension. Lila, wanting more than just stolen moments, urged Alan to leave Deborah, promising they could build a life together if he was willing to take the risk. Alan, however, was hesitant. He had too much to lose: a stable home, his standing in the community, and his pristine career. By December 2007, things had started to unravel. In the wake of Lila's death, Emily revealed that she had overheard arguments between her mother and Alan in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. This information became a crucial lead in the investigation. Detectives began combing through Lila's phone records, emails, and work logs, which uncovered explicit exchanges between her and Alan. These emails revealed the depth of their relationship, but also the growing tension between them. Lila had grown frustrated with Alan's reluctance to leave his wife, while Alan had pleaded for more time, further intensifying the emotional strain between them. As the investigation progressed, Detective Lynch called Alan Hayes in for questioning. Alan arrived at the station, his composed demeanor faltering under the pressure. Initially, Alan denied any involvement with Lila beyond a professional relationship, but when confronted with the emails and text messages, his resolve began to crack. He admitted to the affair, but downplayed its significance, calling it a mistake. but the investigation into Alan's personal life painted a far more complicated picture. Alan had married Deborah when they were both in their early 20s. At the time, he had just started his career in law enforcement, and Deborah had been working as a teaching assistant. Their life together appeared idyllic, marked by family vacations and community events. However, as Alan's career consumed more of his time, the relationship grew distant. Deborah, meanwhile, threw herself into community projects, trying to fill the emotional void created by Alan's absence. Their relationship devolved into one of polite indifference, and the pressure of balancing a failing marriage with an affair weighed heavily on Alan. His colleagues began to notice changes in his behavior, and in the weeks leading up to Lila's death, Alan became more irritable, snapping at junior officers during briefings. Some attributed this to job stress, but in hindsight, it seemed clear that Alan was unraveling. The autopsy results added another layer of complexity to the case. The medical examiner concluded that Lila had been shot at close range, but the angle of the bullet wound made it impossible for her to have pulled the trigger herself. The crime scene had been staged to look like a suicide, but the evidence suggested premeditation. Investigators were now certain they were dealing with a homicide, and all signs pointed to Alan Hayes. In mid-February 2008, the investigation took a significant turn. A routine search of Alan Hayes's car uncovered a jacket with traces of gunpowder residue, providing crucial evidence. CCTV footage from a nearby traffic camera placed Alan's car less than half a mile from Lila's home on the night of the murder. Alan had claimed to be conducting a routine patrol, but the timing of his log-off hours seemed suspicious. He had logged off duty earlier that evening, and the footage suggested otherwise. Meanwhile, Emily Porter's second interview provided another critical piece of information. Emily recalled hearing an argument between her mother and Alan just days before the murder. Though she couldn't make out every word, she described Lila's voice as sharp and insistent, and Alan's tone as low and tense. After the argument, Lila had stormed upstairs, slamming her bedroom door, while Alan left without saying goodbye. This confrontation, coupled with the damning emails between Lila and Alan, painted a picture of a relationship spiraling out of control. The investigation continued, with all evidence pointing to Alan Hayes. As the pressure mounted, Alan's colleagues began to distance themselves from him. Rumors circulated within the police department, and the media soon caught wind of the investigation. Though the details of the case were kept under wraps, it was clear that Alan's previously pristine reputation was beginning to crumble. As more evidence came to light, Detective Lynch's team was inching closer to making an arrest. In early March 2008, a breakthrough came in the form of financial records. Investigators discovered that Deborah Hayes, Alan's wife, had inherited a substantial amount of money, $500,000, from her late father just a month before Lila's murder. The inheritance was deposited into a joint account that Alan shared with Deborah. However, there was a catch. If Deborah were to divorce Alan, he would lose access to that money. The discovery of this financial incentive painted Alan's actions in a new light. His fear of losing everything, not just his marriage, but also his financial stability, seemed to be a significant motivator in the murder of Lila Porter. At the same time, a witness came forward claiming to have seen a car matching Deborah Hayes's vehicle parked near Lila's house on the night of the murder. This new lead cast a shadow of doubt over Deborah's role in the case. Could she have confronted Lila herself, discovering the affair and taking matters into her own hands? Deborah's whereabouts that evening were uncorroborated, and her alibi seemed increasingly shaky. There was no denying that she had motive, a deeply personal betrayal by her husband. But could she have been involved in the murder? Despite the emerging doubts about Deborah's possible involvement, the evidence against Alan Hayes continued to build. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bullet that killed Lila had come from Alan's service weapon. The weapon, which Alan had reported missing a week before the murder, was conveniently found at the crime scene, staged to suggest a suicide. The gunpowder residue on Alan's jacket and the surveillance footage placing him near Lila's home further implicated him in the crime. Despite his protests of innocence, the case against Alan seemed undeniable. As the investigation entered its third week, Detective Lynch felt confident that the time had come to make an arrest. The evidence against Alan Hayes was overwhelming, and the motive had become clear. His affair with Lila, his fear of losing his marriage, and the financial strain caused by Deborah's inheritance had all driven him to commit an unthinkable act. The walls were closing in on him, and Detective Lynch knew it was only a matter of time before the truth was exposed. On March 8, 2008, the arrest of Alan Hayes was carried out in the early hours of the morning while the Hayes family slept. Detectives executed the warrant, hoping to minimize the impact on Alan's two young sons. When Deborah Hayes answered the door, she was visibly disoriented, still in her robe and slippers. She was given a few moments to process the situation before Alan was handcuffed and escorted out of the house. The children, awakened by the commotion, stood at the top of the stairs, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Deborah's expression shifted from shock to fury, but whether her anger was directed at Alan or the officers was unclear. Alan maintained his composure as he was led to the patrol car, but his eyes betrayed a growing sense of panic. Neighbors began to peer through their curtains, whispering amongst themselves. The once respected trooper, now marked by scandal and suspicion, was being led away in handcuffs. His carefully constructed life was unraveling in front of his family, his colleagues, and the community that had once admired him. At the police station, Alan was charged with first-degree murder. His silence during the booking process spoke volumes, a stark contrast to his earlier defiance during questioning. When asked about the murder, Alan requested a lawyer immediately, signaling that he knew the gravity of the situation. Despite his attempts to distance himself from the crime, the evidence was irrefutable. Deborah Hayes, initially questioned as a potential co-conspirator, was not formally implicated in the crime. While her role remained ambiguous, there was no concrete evidence to suggest that she had played a part in the murder. However, the lingering suspicion surrounding her actions left the detectives and the public to speculate. Had she been complicit in the cover-up, or had she been another victim of Alan's lies and betrayal? The investigation had reached a critical point, but the true motivations behind Lila Porter's murder were still the subject of much debate. As the legal process began, the questions surrounding Alan's actions and the role of his wife Deborah continued to haunt the community of Hanover, New Hampshire. Part 4. The Trial and the Aftermath. The trial of Alan Hayes began in August 2009, drawing national attention to a case that had already captivated the small town of Hanover. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious locals, and those directly affected by the tragedy. Alan, once a pillar of the community, now sat at the defendant's table, his clean-cut image replaced by a somber, weathered face. His demeanor was tense as the prosecution laid bare the tangled web of betrayal, emotional manipulation, and murder. For the prosecution, the case was clear-cut. District Attorney Marlene Carson, a seasoned litigator, painted a vivid picture of Alan as a desperate man who had risked everything for a fleeting affair. When Lila began to threaten exposing the relationship, Alan had seen no other way to protect his family, his career, and his finances than to silence her permanently. Carson emphasized Alan's financial motives, pointing out that Deborah Hayes's recent inheritance of $500,000 was a critical factor in the murder. A divorce would not only expose the affair, but strip Allen of his financial security. The prosecution's case was built on forensic evidence. The ballistic match between Allen's service weapon and the fatal bullet, the gunpowder residue found on his jacket, and the surveillance footage placing him near Lila's home on the night of the murder, all worked together to paint a damning portrait of Allen. The prosecution argued that Allen was a man cornered by his own actions, who lashed out violently to protect his reputation and his livelihood. A pivotal moment in the trial came when Emily Porter, Lila's teenage daughter, took the stand. Emily's testimony was heart-wrenching. She spoke about the impact of the affair and the subsequent murder on her life, describing the arguments she had overheard between her mother and Allen. Although she couldn't understand all the details at the time, her recollection of the tension and fear in her mother's voice added a deeply personal layer to the prosecution's narrative. The defense, led by attorney Paul Grayson, attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Grayson argued that Allen was being framed, suggesting that Deborah Hayes might have had a greater motive for the murder. He pointed to her possible jealousy and emotional instability as potential reasons for her involvement. However, Grayson's strategy faltered when Deborah herself took the stand. Under immunity, Deborah testified about her emotional turmoil upon discovering the affair. She described the feelings of betrayal and shock, but she denied any involvement in the murder. Her testimony painted a picture of a woman who was devastated by her husband's infidelity, but had not played a role in the death of Lila Porter. Deborah explained that after learning of the affair, she had confronted Allen, and the two had numerous heated arguments in the weeks leading up to the murder. Despite their rocky relationship, Deborah remained adamant that she had never intended harm to Lila or anyone else. The defense also tried to undermine the credibility of the evidence against Allen, suggesting that the ballistics report could have been flawed, or that someone else could have planted the gun near the scene. However, forensic experts firmly rejected these theories, affirming the bullet's match to Allen's weapon and the gun's presence at the scene as direct evidence of his involvement. Despite Grayson's best efforts to sow doubt, the weight of the evidence seemed overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few days before reaching a verdict. Allen Hayes was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence handed down was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the verdict, Allen sat motionless, his face pale and devoid of emotion. His family members, including his young sons, sat in the courtroom, their expressions a mixture of confusion and sadness. Deborah Hayes, who had been standing by her husband throughout the trial, broke down in tears, unsure of how to reconcile the man she had once loved with the person now convicted of a heinous crime. The emotional impact of the trial was felt deeply within the community. For months, local newspapers covered every detail of the trial, and people speculated about the motivations behind Lila's murder. Some questioned whether Deborah had known more than she let on, while others felt sympathy for her, understanding the toll that years of emotional neglect and betrayal had taken on her. For Emily Porter, the aftermath was just as painful as the trial itself. She had lost her mother in the most traumatic way possible, and now found herself navigating life without both of her parents. While she was surrounded by family and friends who offered their support, the void left by her mother's death was impossible to fill. She had to come to terms with the fact that Allen Hayes, someone she had once trusted, had been responsible for the brutal death of her mother. Emily's testimony had been pivotal in securing the conviction, but the emotional toll of reliving those painful memories in front of strangers left her feeling hollow and broken. In the months that followed the trial, Emily sought therapy to help her cope with the overwhelming grief and the complex emotions surrounding her mother's death. It was a difficult process, but Emily found strength in the memories of her mother. the strong, compassionate woman who had dedicated herself to her work and to being the best possible mother. Though Lila's death had shattered her world, Emily was determined to honor her mother's legacy and move forward with her life, albeit with a deep and lasting scar. For the New Hampshire State Police, the case served as a tragic reminder of the complexities of human relationships, even within the confines of a tight-knit professional community. The investigation and trial had revealed the lengths to which Alan Hayes was willing to go to protect his own interests, no matter the cost to those around him. The police force, which had once been proud of Alan's work, was left grappling with the stain of his betrayal. While the case was officially closed with Alan's conviction, the haunting question of motive lingered in the minds of many. Was it truly just a case of a man overwhelmed by fear and selfishness, or was there something deeper at play? Something that had pushed Alan to commit such a horrific act? Some speculated about the toll of years of suppressed emotions, loneliness, and frustration, while others pointed to the tragic consequences of a fleeting affair that spiraled out of control. As the years passed, the memory of Lila Porter lived on in the town of Hanover. Her story became a symbol of both the fragility of life and the devastating impact of hidden emotional struggles. Those who knew her remembered her as a kind and dedicated officer, a loving mother who had given everything for her family, and a woman who had faced the pressures of her career and personal life with grace and resilience. Though she was gone, her legacy remained, etched into the hearts of those who had loved her. Deborah Hayes, in the wake of her husband's conviction, quietly tried to rebuild her life, though she knew that nothing could ever truly return to normal. She focused on raising her sons, who struggled with the loss of their father and the shame of his actions. Deborah faced a lifetime of grappling with the complexity of her emotions: grief for the man she had loved and lost, shame for her part in the circumstances that had led to the murder, and a deep sorrow for the victims of Alan's choices. As for Alan, his life in prison was marked by isolation and regret. The life he had once taken for granted was now forever out of his reach. His former colleagues, once supportive, now saw him as a pariah. And while some tried to understand the personal demons that had driven him to murder, there were others who would never forgive the irreversible damage he had caused. The case of Lila Porter, which had begun as a tragic and bewildering crime, had ultimately laid bare the human costs of dishonesty, betrayal, and unchecked emotions. It served as a painful lesson to those who knew Lila and those who followed the case, that even the most well-crafted facades can crumble under the weight of secrets and lies. If you like those types of videos, then hit the subscribe button and also like this video.